तत्सवितुर्वरं रूपं ज्योतिः परस्य धीमहि यन्नः सत्येन दीपयेत्। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। My dear sisters and brothers, love and blessings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Today is a special day, as you all know, this 74th anniversary of India's independence and the 149th birthday of Sri Aurobindo. And it is the beginning of the celebrations of India 75 and Sri Aurobindo 150, which we are all looking forward to exactly after a year. And that makes this 15th August day very special, the type of which comes only once in 50 years. And it's my privilege to be speaking to all of you today, this morning. The topic that I have been asked to speak on today is the relevance of Sri Aurobindo for the young. Fortunately, there is a sizable number of young people, growing in number, in India, who now no longer say that they are just looking forward to a successful career, a career in which they'll have a well-paid job. So many young people these days are saying that of course they want a career because one has to make a living, but they also want to do the type of work that will give them satisfaction, that will have some meaning, that will help them fulfill the purpose of life. But then at the same time, one also finds that while they have this general idea that the career should provide for more than a living and should have some meaning and purpose behind it, so many of them really do not know what that purpose is. Not that in this short time that I have today, I'll be able to dilate upon that purpose, but still I'll try to say a few things which may be relevant to this general idea of looking forward to a career and then combining it with meaning and purpose. And I'll not start with Sri Aurobindo, I'll start with a relatively recent idea which a psychologist, Goleman, came up with a few decades ago, and that is the idea of emotional quotient. What he found basically was that for people to be successful in their career, the intelligence alone is not enough. IQ may contribute, but in fact it's not the most intelligent who become the most successful, but rather those who have the highest emotional quotient. And one of the components of this emotional quotient is that the person should be aware of his own feelings and should be able to manage his feelings. And of course the other two components are the person should be aware of the feelings of others and should be able to manage the feelings of others. Now coming to being aware of one's own feelings, this growing idea that I should get some satisfaction from work, some genuine satisfaction from work, I should find the work enjoyable, shows a greater awareness of one's own emotions. And this is one of the factors which in fact contributes also to success. So having a meaningful career, a good career, is not only compatible with success, the type of career that the person is made for, it is not only compatible with success, it is also compatible with meaning. And therefore all these things in fact go together. And if I were to dilate upon it a bit, what makes this combination is the fact that the person should be good at the work, which means that the person should have those unique gifts, talents and training which make him good for that particular type of work. Talents and gifts to some extent we are born with, and then further training and qualifications and abilities we acquire as we grow up. But then if the two have been well matched, the type of training we got and the unique gifts and talents we had, then it leads to a ability in a particular area for which that person is specially well equipped. Then, of course, equally important is to realize that we all have some strengths, but we also have some weaknesses. So one should choose the type of work in which the unique talents are best utilized and where the weaknesses of the person don't matter. Because after all, every job doesn't require every type of ability, and nobody has to do everything. So we can always find something where the talents of this person will be best utilized and where the weaknesses of this person will not matter. For example, if I can't sing, I need not sing. Either I can talk without singing the way it's happening today, or as it's more common in the satsang here, someone sings first and then I come to speak. So, one can always do something where the weaknesses of the person don't matter. But along with that, this is something which is now common knowledge. One thing which we overlook is that to get true happiness from the work, the person should also be passionate about the work. A person may be good at a certain type of work, but if he's not passionately involved in it, if the feelings are not there, if the person doesn't have a sense of deep commitment to it, then again he will not be very successful. Yet there is a third thing, which is even less commonly understood, and that is, along with all this, the work should also be ethically sound. And to give a crude example, suppose there's a pickpocket. He's an expert in his job. He's passionate about it, but still he doesn't enjoy his job because he knows somewhere deep within that this is not ethically sound, I'm doing something wrong. And therefore, he doesn't enjoy his work. He does it because it gives him easy money. But otherwise, he's not really enjoying it. So the work should be ethically sound. And this is again important because one of the favorite careers of the young people today is to enter the business world. And the business world, since times immemorial, has not been the most ethical thing in the world. By temperament, a successful businessman has a lot of rajas, substantial tamas, because basically he works because he's driven by the ambitions and desires for whatever that work brings him. But otherwise, he has a substantial tamas and very little sattva. So, this is the typical combination of a businessman, and therefore, business is not always a very highly ethical world. But not that business, of course, has to go on. But what is important, the message that this should send is that even the businessmen and the people who work for businessmen will enjoy their work more, the more they bring ethics into their business. That is the positive way of looking at this message. Okay. So, this is what makes for that combination. Now, let's understand that in terms of Sri Aurobindo's life, and since many of you may not be very familiar with it, I'll outline it very briefly. He was born on the 15th of August in 1872, and for the first 7 years he had an upbringing which again exposed him to the westernized atmosphere, because his father's feeling was that our own Indian civilization is now obsolete, and if we have to learn something useful and if we have to make progress in the world, if India has to find a place in the Committee of Nations, then we'll have to copy the ways of the Western world. And therefore, he employed a British governess to look after his children at home, and as soon as they were grown up enough to go to school, he sent them to Loreto Convent School in Darjeeling, which was run by Irish nuns. So that is how the first 7 years of Sri Aurobindo's life was spent, from 1872 to 1879. And in keeping with his thinking, when Sri Aurobindo was 1879, he, along with his two elder brothers, was left in England to study. So that is the age at which, the age of 7, at which Sri Aurobindo went to England for further studies, and he spent 14 years there. He came back in 1893. So this was the second phase of his life, or you can say more or less the first phase, from 1879 to 1893 in England, studying there. The third phase was in Baroda, exclusively in Baroda from 1893 to 1905, a period of about 12 years. And after that, a more and more open involvement in the freedom struggle from 1905 to 1910. A brief period, but a very important period in his life. And then came a long 40-year period from 1910 to 1950, which he spent in Pondicherry as a spiritual master. So that is the outline of his life. Now let's first take the period from 1879 to 1893 when he was in England. He was extremely intelligent, and therefore, while he was still a schoolboy, his poetry was published in British magazines. When he was in college in Cambridge, he did so well that many of his professors remarked that in their entire career, they have not seen answer sheets as good as that. He won many scholarships, and if he had gone on along those lines and enjoyed that glamorous life of England, it was far more glamorous even those days than life in India, he could have easily gone on studying there and become a professor, a don, in his alma mater at Cambridge, in the University of Cambridge, married a British girl, and lived in luxury for the rest of his life. But somewhere deep within, while he was made for this type of life, he had all the unique talents and gifts for it, it didn't seem to him the right thing to do. So, outright it is not an unethical thing to do. But then the standards of ethics can depend upon the individual a lot. That is what this brings out. Which means that whatever seems ethical to the rest of the world need not be ethical for you. You can be more sensitive than the rest. So this is not the type of life that appealed to him at all. The next thing that he could have done is what his father wanted him to do. His father wanted him to come back to India and become an ICS officer. Now, to this end, he did make some preparation, probably to satisfy his father. He kept completing the requirements of ICS while studying at Cambridge. But then when it came to the final touches to that qualification, he voluntarily absented himself from the horse riding test to get disqualified from being an ICS officer. And he was given more opportunities, probably at least 2 more opportunities, but he absented himself every time to make very sure that he will not be qualified for becoming an ICS officer when he returns to India. Now, why did he do that? Again, to become an ICS officer to the rest of the world may not sound something unethical, but to him it was highly unethical to come and serve a government which had enslaved our country. So, what did he want to do instead? He wanted to work for the freedom of the country. So, in spite of his father's designs, in spite of his father's efforts, apparently successful, to shield his children from all influences Indian, here was his son who, instead of becoming an ICS officer, wanted to work for the freedom of the country when he came back to India. So, he did not qualify for ICS. How about completing his education at Cambridge? Again, he had completed all the requirements for the graduation, tripos, but it required a certain minimum period of study apart from clearing all the exams. He kept clearing all the exams prematurely, and the result was that while he had probably still 1 more year compulsorily, which he had to stay in England to complete his tripos, he felt that I have learnt enough from here, let me go back to India. India was calling him. And therefore, without completing his tripos, he came to India. And it's quite possible that since he was very bright and he had completed all the other requirements, if he had just put in an application to say that I have to, for some compelling reasons, go back to India, please give me a degree, they would have given him. But he didn't care for it. The degree was not important to him. So, again, what is important to the rest of the world may not be important to you. Which means that, we are learning from Sri Aurobindo that you can afford to be different. And in fact, being different is the very basis of progress. If everybody goes on doing what everybody else is doing, then the world will continue as it is. We all want progress, but then if you just try to think a little bit and you will realize that all progress depends on change. It depends upon tomorrow being different from today. That is a change. We all want progress, but we don't want to change. And that is something important for us to understand, particularly the youth of India, because by and large, we are still a conventional society. And a conventional society tends to perpetuate, reinforce, and sort of make it feel more or less the normal thing to do what everybody else is doing and what we have been doing for hundreds of years. That is what kind of conventional society is about. We want rebels. We want those rebels like Sri Aurobindo, who had the courage to differ. And if they thought that this is what I have to do, this is what I think is right, they did it. He did it. So that is the type of rebels we in fact want today. So that is one of the messages, important messages which this should send. So he came back without becoming a professor at Cambridge, without qualifying for an ICS post. He came back without a degree in 1893 after spending 14 years in England, during which he not only mastered the English language better than the British, he also learnt very well the classical European languages, Greek and Latin, and also acquired a fairly good knowledge of several other European languages, particularly French, Spanish, and German. And with all this in his pocket, he came back in 1893 with the important sort of resolve in his mind that he wanted to work for the freedom of the country. But what did he do when he came back in 1893? He didn't jump into the freedom struggle. And you are quite entitled to ask why he did not jump into the freedom struggle. You can call it divine intervention. Because before he came back to India, the Maharaja of Baroda was in England, and he was looking for someone like someone educated there, who could do certain types of jobs for him. And somebody, one of his friends, the Maharaja's friends, referred him to Sri Aurobindo, and he interviewed Sri Aurobindo in Cambridge and told him that when you come to India, a job is waiting for you. So that's how Sri Aurobindo went to Baroda as soon as he came back to India in 1893 to take up a job with the Maharaja of Baroda, and there he went on to become a professor who was teaching both English and French, and eventually became also the vice principal of the college. And if he had wanted, he could have just continued with that. But then why didn't he jump into the freedom struggle? That question still remains. That you will understand by the time we reach the end. Because you see, the divine intervention was necessary because his final calling, his inner calling, was not to be a professor at Baroda, but something else. And for that, preparation was necessary. And that preparation required time. And that time he got in Baroda as a teacher in the college. What was it that he did there which turned out to be very useful preparation for what he ultimately had to do? In Baroda, he realized that while he had not only learned so many European languages, he had also understood and assimilated the Western culture, and being very intelligent, he had looked at it critically and seen it in the historical perspective, seen its past as well as future. All that he had done with his extremely sharp intellect. But then he knew nothing about India. About India and the Indian culture, he was totally ignorant. And he decided to make up for that deficiency. And that required time, and that is what was probably the most important thing that he did in Baroda. He spent that period in Baroda to teach himself Sanskrit. He was so bright that he learnt it on his own. And not just a smattering of Sanskrit, he learned Sanskrit so well that he could go into the ancient Indian scriptures in their original, and once again he did the same thing. He understood them, he assimilated them, he looked at them critically, and he looked at them in terms of the past of India and what role this knowledge and wisdom could play in the future. So all this he did for 12 years. The result was that he became a totally unprecedented synthesis of the East and the West. The West he learnt 14 years in England, and about the East he learnt in 12, which to some extent stretched on to 14 in Baroda, because he finally severed his connections with Baroda only in 1907. That was his last visit to Baroda. But whatever way you look at it, this long period in Baroda was preparation for what he ultimately had to do. And that is why this divine, what he ultimately had to do, we'll see. So that is why this divine intervention, which means that sometimes, one also has to learn that there are signals sent from some higher force which directs us in a certain way, and one can catch those signals also. And that is probably what he did. So instead of jumping straight away into the freedom struggle full time, he spent this long period of more than 12 years in Baroda. And that is what ended up equipping him as a synthesis of the East and the West, which had an important role in what he ultimately had to do in life, what his final calling was. And that is why, once again, we find that while he was teaching at Baroda, doing an extremely good job out of it, his students were very fond of him. At least one of them went on to become very famous as a proponent of the Indian culture, K.M. Munshi, who founded the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. And his students had a lot of nice things to say about him. But at the same time, there was something else going on in his mind. And pointers to what was going in his mind come from a letter that he wrote to his wife. He got married in 1901 to Mrinalini Devi. And shortly after his marriage, while his wife was in Calcutta, he wrote to her a letter which has become famous, in which he wrote to her that I have 3 madnesses. What were these madnesses? The first madness is that I want the country to be free. And the justification he gave was that how would a son feel if his mother's blood is being sucked by a demon? So he looked upon the British as a demon sucking the blood of Bharat Mata, and he felt that he was the son of that Bharat Mata. He looked upon the country not as a piece of land but his mother, and he said, I want to free the country. What is the second madness? The second madness was that if I keep for myself more than is necessary, I would consider myself a thief. He was getting a fabulous salary of about 500 rupees a month at Baroda. It was a princely sum those days. But then what he used to do was, the salary was paid in coins. So he'd put all those coins in a big bowl, leave them somewhere around in an area which was exposed to everybody, for anybody to pick up whatever the person wanted, and he just used a little bit whatever he needed for his minimal requirements. He was a very simple man, even in Baroda. Lived the life of a yogi before he came to be known as a yogi. So, now, again, if you are getting some money every month and it is legitimate income, you may pay income tax on it, but then to use the rest for your own requirements is legally and morally valid in the normal sense. But to him it looked that if I use more than is necessary for me, I'll be a thief. So once again, the courage to differ and a standard of ethics which is not the ordinary worldly standard. And what was the third madness? The third madness was that if there is a God, I want to see him. So his acceptance of the existence of God was conditional. If there is a God, he was not sure. And in fact, how many of us are? Although people believe in God, by and large, more than 90% of the world believes in a higher force, whom we generally call God. One of the names we give to that higher force is God. But how many people are actually sure about it? Very few. He wanted to be sure. So that's why he raised this question. If there is a God, I want to see him. Now, here is this newly married man. Instead of living a life of luxury as a professor in Baroda, which he could go on doing for the rest of his life, he is talking about freeing his mother from a demon, being a thief if he uses more money than is necessary, and seeing God. So unusual. But then he was an unusual person, and that's why he was talking about it. And once again, something to learn, that not only he gave up many things when he was in England, which he could have done, which could have been materially much more profitable and in the ordinary sense perfectly legally and morally valid, he'd left all those things. He also eventually left this job in Baroda because of one of these madnesses. He wanted to free the country, free the motherland, free Bharat Mata. So it was for that he left Baroda, and he jumped full time into the freedom struggle. His most unique gift was the gift of the use of language. So he spoke and he wrote a lot to galvanize the youth of the country, to make them see what their duty to the motherland at this point in time is, and gave them a clear-cut mission to work for, not only a mission, but also the method that they could use. And what was the method? He outlined in great detail the theory of boycott, passive resistance. Basically, what passive resistance means is that without apparently breaking any law, you can make it very difficult for a government to govern you. So that is one of the basic principles. You just have to boycott certain things. And while boycotting those things, you are not breaking any rule. There are 5 types of boycott he talked about, but because of shortage of time, I'll just stick to one, which is the best known, in fact, and that is boycott goods made abroad. Use only things made in India. Now, you're not breaking any law. No government compels you to buy things which have been made elsewhere and not within your own country. And yet, just by doing one thing, if every Indian did it in 1905, it would have become very unprofitable for the British to govern us, because they were here for profit. What they were doing was using India as a source of raw material, shipping it to England, manufacturing some products out of it, sending them back to India, because India had a huge market and Indians were buying those goods. So much so that whether it was cloth or textiles or whether it was a safety pin, everything was made in England. And if Indians decided to live a little uncomfortable life if necessary, but use only things that were made in India and started making those things, the British would have found it very unprofitable to rule India. And this was one of the components of the boycott. And another component which is very interesting was social boycott, which means that Indians should boycott those Indians who do not follow the rest of the boycott. Which means if some Indians still continue to buy foreign-made goods, they can be boycotted socially. Social boycott means don't invite them to your house. If they invite you, don't go to their house. Don't marry your child to their child, and so on and so forth. These are things which even today we can understand in India can be a very powerful force. So social boycott. Again, you're not breaking any rules by doing this. So there were 5 types of boycott: educational boycott, judicial boycott, executive boycott. So 5 types of boycott. But the basic thing was not cooperating with the government and doing it as far as possible without breaking any rules, making it difficult and unprofitable for the government to rule us. And that is the outline that he gave. So the blueprint was ready, everything was done, and he was extremely well suited for continuing with the freedom struggle. He had all the mental, moral equipment and the courage to continue with the freedom struggle. But then what happened? Again, there was a divine intervention to pull him out of the freedom struggle. And the divine intervention was to get him sent to jail for 1 year from 1908 to 1909. Now, why was that necessary? He was sent to jail to interrupt his involvement in the freedom struggle. And when he had discovered the true mission of his life, arrangements were also made that he'll be released and not convicted. So that is how he ended up spending 1 year in jail. Now this requires a little elaboration, because those who are not familiar with his life may find it difficult, may find that I'm living in some sort of a fantasy land talking about a divine intervention and arrangements being made not only for his imprisonment but also for his acquittal and his discovering the mission of his life in jail and so on and so forth. Now, for him to be sent to jail and his work getting interrupted was important, because otherwise on his own he would have gone on continuing with the freedom struggle. So to interrupt it, that divine intervention was necessary. Secondly, not only the work had to be interrupted, he had to be shown what he had to do instead of it. Instead of the freedom struggle, what else he had to do. And once again, he was told by the divine itself, he saw Sri Krishna in prison, everywhere, in everything and everybody. And he could have a dialogue with Sri Krishna. And it was from him that he directly learnt a few things through this intervention. One, that he was not indispensable for the freedom struggle. Sri Aurobindo realized that he was not indispensable for the freedom struggle. Sri Krishna gave him the assurance that it is my promise that the country will be free, you don't have to continue with it. Now, as if to sort of show that that promise made by Sri Krishna had been fulfilled, the country did become free. And when did it become free? On Sri Aurobindo's 75th birthday. So this was a sort of a confirmation that this promise had been fulfilled. Second thing that he showed him was that he was not indispensable for the freedom struggle, but he had to do something else. And what was it that he had to do? He had to share with the world that wisdom which only he could give. Now you can say that what was that wisdom that the world has not known in such a long time, in all these thousands of years, which only Sri Aurobindo could give to the world? Now it's not the wisdom which is old, but it is the circumstances in which it has to be passed on which keep changing, and that is why we need recasting this wisdom to suit the circumstances. And Sri Aurobindo could give this wisdom, and none else could, because he was a unique combination. And now I can talk about that unique combination, because now you have a little background in terms of what I have already spoken. He was a perfect synthesis of the East and the West. He had an extremely sharp intellect, and he had phenomenal spiritual capacity, as shown by his vision of Sri Krishna in prison and everything and everybody, and his being able to have a dialogue with Sri Krishna. Phenomenal spiritual capacity. This type of a combination is totally unprecedented in history, unlikely to be repeated in the near future, and it had been brought into this world not to be battered and bruised by the British police, but for something higher than even the freedom of the country. Even the freedom of the country, because working for the freedom of the country was a very noble task. And I must pay my respects to all those who worked for the freedom of the country, which is making us breathe this air of freedom today. In fact, I was one of the first beneficiaries of it, being born in exactly the year 1947, about 3 months after the country became free. So I'm grateful to all of them. So working for the freedom of the country was a noble task. But for that, there were lakhs of people available in the country, and that's how we could become free. But how many Sri Aurobindos in India? Not even one. A totally unprecedented combination. How many Sri Aurobindos in the world? Not even one. How many have been born in the world earlier? Not even one. How many are likely to be born in the near future? Can't say. Very unlikely. Now, this type of a rare combination was not meant for fighting for the freedom of the country, but for something which will help the entire world. And within this, again, there were 2 missions which he was given by Sri Krishna. One particularly related to India, and one related to the whole world. Now, coming to these one by one. The first mission, what was the mission related to India? Wake up this country. Wake up this country from slumber. Societies can also go to sleep. They can get tired. This is a country which had a sustained productivity of spiritual wisdom and material progress. The two went together in this country. There was never a dichotomy between spiritual life and worldly life. So, phenomenal spiritual development and the peak of material progress sustained for at least more than 3,000 years, from about 5,000 years ago till about 2,000 years ago. No other example exists in history for this type of sustained productivity. But then after that, like people get tired, societies also get tired. We also started getting tired, and the result was we started stagnating, we started declining, because either you can continue to progress or you can decline. You can't stay at the same place forever. That's a general principle. But if you've gone very high, the decline will be slow. So our decline was slow for about 1,000 years. Not perceived very well. But by the time 1,000 years had passed, which means I'm talking of 1,000 years ago. So 1,000 years ago, the decline became perceptible, and the result was that we were enslaved. We were enslaved for the first time in 1192. That was the first successful Muslim invasion, 1192. So it was this decline that led to our enslavement, and enslavement further accelerated the decline. And the result was that the country had gone to sleep. It had started believing that we are destined to be a poor, backward nation. Our masters, particularly the British masters, are the ones to whom we have to look up, and that we will never be able to fight them, we'll never be able to equal them. That is the sort of a sleep into which this country had gone, forgetting what this country had been for 4,000 years, starting about 5,000 years ago till about 1,000 years ago, because even till 1,000 years ago, the decline was not very perceptible. Even 1,000 years ago, India was second to none, whether it came to education or whether it came to science and technology, or whether it came to prosperity. We were second to none. And that is one of the things which attracted all the invaders to us. They came to us for prosperity, not for just the fun of defeating us in a war. That's not what the invaders came for. And when they got that opportunity, they made us feel further inferior. The decline accelerated, and they plundered us so that they became a very poor nation. They destroyed our system of education so that we forgot our own wisdom. So all this they did over a period of about 800 years. And that is how we reached where we were in 1947. A country which had the best of universities in the world and 100% literacy became a country with just 12% literacy when they left us in 1947. So anyway, that is not the topic that actually we have today. What we have to see is that what I was coming back to where I was, that Sri Aurobindo was an unprecedented combination. He had a mission for India and the world. That is what he was made conscious of by Sri Krishna. And this mission of waking up India in today's world, in today's times, none else could do as well as Sri Aurobindo did. Because he had seen both the East and the West and realized that this country has something unique and that has not yet died completely, and therefore that India is not dead, India is only asleep. Why I'm saying that, you can see it even today. Talk to a man in the street, and it doesn't take you too long for him to say sentences like this: God is everywhere, God is in everything, God is in wood and in stone and in plant and in animal, and whatever happens in life is because God wills it, and whatever God wills has something good behind it. Now, these are things which are in our blood. This is spiritual wisdom. It does not come equally easily to a person in the West, even today. They look at life more rationally, and therefore they will question everything that happens instead of ascribing it to God's will. God's will is in one corner. Yes, that's what the Bible says, thy will be done. But then that is in one corner. When it comes to actual practice, they question everything. So, I'm not saying that one should not question. That's also again important. Because Sri Aurobindo was not against reason. In fact, he could reason better than most people who are proud of their capacity to reason are. And he was the best logician perhaps ever born. And if one has to understand it, it's not easy, because then you have to read a book like The Life Divine. That is where you discover what way he used logic, making us realize that we don't even know what logic is about. And as one of my students once put it very nicely, when you read The Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo gives you an affectionate slap. That's when you realize that you thought you were a very good thinker, you don't even know how to think. So Sri Aurobindo was not against reason, but then he went beyond reason, because reason is not the ultimate tool for getting all knowledge. There's knowledge which comes only from a level higher than reason. But that doesn't mean that we have to say that, well, if there is something higher than reason, why should I bother about reason? We still have to bother about reason, because it's only by understanding reason that you can go higher than reason. For example, suppose you want to go to space, to outer space. In outer space, there's no gravity. But can anybody go to outer space without understanding the laws of gravity? Which means you first have to understand gravity, then only you can transcend gravity and be in space. So if you have to go to that space which is beyond reason, first you have to understand reason. So I'm not discounting reason. But what I'm trying to say is that this wisdom, which goes beyond reason, is there in our blood, and even in a man in the street, illiterate man in the street talks of these things. So Indian culture is not dead, but India was asleep, and to some extent it is asleep even today, because to wake up from a slumber which has gone on for more than 1,000 years is not easy. So to some extent, that's why this message was relevant then, and this message is relevant today. So Sri Aurobindo, when he was given this mission by the divine, first wake up India. Now you understand why he was told to wake up India, and why he was best equipped to do it. Because he understood the modern world as a whole. He was not going to take us to 5,000 years back and try to duplicate the world of 5,000 years ago. That would be a terrible mistake. He knew that what we have to do is a process of what he called critical assimilation, which means assimilate from everywhere but critically, which means if you accept something, it should be because you understand it. If you reject something, that should also be because you understand it. If you reject reason, you should understand reason. If you reject the West, you should understand the West first, and that he had done. So that's why his rejection of the West was also selective and critical. He didn't reject everything in the West. And that is one thing we have to understand, because young people sometimes forget. They swing to one extreme or the other. They say, well, the West has made so much progress, so let's also ape the Western world. Aping the Western means dressing up like them, learning their language, and picking up a few sort of superficial things in their lifestyle. That is not Westernization. The bedrock of European Renaissance, which started in the 16th century, was a sense of inquiry, freedom of thought, and the urge to experiment. These were the three basic things that led to the development of science and technology in Europe after the European Renaissance of the 16th century. If we have to pick up something from the West, these are the three things to pick up: the spirit of inquiry, freedom of thought, and the urge to experiment. So don't reject the West altogether, but then learning the languages of the West or aping their lifestyle is not learning something from the West. So select critically, accept because you understand, reject because you understand. Now coming back to, again, I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little too much. Two missions, one for India, wake up India, the second mission for the world. What was that mission for the world, and why was it necessary at that point in time? In the divine scheme, it had been foreseen, and Sri Aurobindo has revealed it in some of his major works, that the West was approaching a point where it would have experimented with all the tools based on reason for wiping out the basic problems of human existence. Now, what are the basic problems of human existence? Inequality, injustice, misery, and suffering. These are the basic problems of human existence. And to wipe these out, what did the Western world do within the last 400 or 500 years? They pressed into service the same instrument which had served very well for development of science and technology. So, what did they come up with? They came up with first with science and technology, and thought science and technology will itself wipe out misery and suffering from the world. That didn't happen. Then they used it for coming up with different political systems, and if you look at it, communism and democracy, the two major systems that they came up with, are both very rational, both very well intentioned, but both failed. That shows the limitations of reason. I'll not go into the details. Again, I'll be digressing too much if I start doing that. But they failed. The best product of rationality was humanism. Humanism, a code of ethics based entirely on reason. Sri Aurobindo says that also will fail, and it failed. And he explains why it will fail. So when the West has exhausted all these experiments with reason, what it will start doing is start looking at something higher than reason for solving the problems of human existence. And why would they want to solve it? Because it is not only because we wanted to wipe it out from the world, we want to wipe it out from our own life also. So human beings, in order to be happy, in order to find out a lasting solution to sorrow, which seems to be an inevitable part of human life, they will start looking at something higher than reason, because all the possibilities of reason would have been exhausted, and these failed experiments would have also served a purpose, because at least they would have taught the West what is it that does not work. So when they have discovered what is it does not work, they'll start looking at something different. And the different will be something higher than reason. And where will they find it? In ancient Indian wisdom. And how will they find it? They will not read the Upanishads and the Gita in Sanskrit. It will be much more convenient if they get it in English. And couched in a language which is contemporary in nature, which takes into account what has happened in Europe over the last 400 years, or for that matter, over the last few thousand years, starting with the Greeks and Romans. Because in fact, there's a continuity. We have a continuity in history. They also have a different type of continuity in history, starting with the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Dark Ages, and then the European Renaissance, bringing them more or less to where they are now, and now discovering that this misery and suffering is not gone. We have to look at something else, something different. And that is what will make them look at India. And to provide that Indian wisdom in contemporary terms, in the language which they speak, who else could do better than Sri Aurobindo? That is why he had to do something for India, and he had to do something for the world. And that is why the freedoms struggle, from the freedom struggle, he had to be pulled out by the divine, sent to jail, make him discover all this, give him that promise the country will be free, and tell him what his mission in life was. And that done, he had to be released. What were the arrangements made for his release? He got as a lawyer Deshbandhu Chitranjan Das, a bright lawyer who gave up all his practice to devote all his time to one single case. But then, the lawyer is only the master of law. The facts still have to be provided by the client. So Sri Aurobindo had to provide him the facts for being defended. But Sri Krishna again told Sri Aurobindo, don't provide any facts to the lawyer, don't tell him anything, I will instruct him. So Sri Aurobindo kept quiet. On the basis of the instructions which Sri Krishna gave to the lawyer, which means that those thoughts were put into his ideas, were put into the lawyer's mind by the divine, he prepared the case very well. Second intervention, which ensured his release, looked stupid on the part of the British government. They were so keen and eager to convict him, but whom did they appoint as a judge for this case? The judge appointed for this case in the court was none other than C.P. Beechcroft, who was a classmate of Sri Aurobindo in England. Looks what such a silly thing to do. Did they have a scarcity of judges? Was this secret knowledge? Couldn't they have foreseen that this judge, having been a classmate of Sri Aurobindo in England at Cambridge, he might have a soft corner for Sri Aurobindo? Could they not have foreseen all this? And yet they appointed him. So that's why Sri Aurobindo says the divine works through those who work for him, and the divine also works through those who oppose him. So this was the British work, the divine working through the British to appoint that judge. And nobody can rule out that there was no subjective bias, because there were several hundreds of pages devoted to Sri Aurobindo in that case. And while sifting through those hundreds of pages, one can't rule out that there might have been a subjective bias in the mind of the judge when he came to the conclusion that the evidence is not enough to convict Sri Aurobindo, and therefore he may be released. So the arrangement was made for his release after he had discovered the mission of his life, after the mission of his life had been revealed to him. He was not kept in jail for a day less, not a day more. Released exactly when it was necessary. So he was out of jail in 1909, and by 1910 he left. But before leaving, he gave a message to his countrymen, which turned out to be prophetic. He said, for every movement, there's a God-sent leader. And for the freedom movement, that God-sent leader is yet to come. Which means that he considered that he was not that God-sent leader for the freedom movement, because that is what he had been told in prison, that your job is something else. But then he could not still see in 1910 another leader who could take over the leadership of the freedom movement from him. So that's why he said that God-sent leader for the freedom movement is yet to come. This was a prophetic statement, because after about 10 years, Mahatma Gandhi took over that leadership, used the same blueprint very liberally. That's how today we have a tendency to associate Swadeshi and non-cooperation with Mahatma Gandhi. Of course, Mahatma Gandhi did it. He translated it into action. But then this blueprint had been prepared by Sri Aurobindo about 10 years before Mahatma Gandhi took it up. So this was a prophetic statement. The God-sent leader came and he liberated the country. That was Mahatma Gandhi. But Sri Aurobindo had prepared the background, and as Dr. Karan Singh says in his book on Sri Aurobindo, that although Sri Aurobindo's involvement in the freedom struggle was very brief, in terms of power and passion, it has never been equaled. None else has had that power and passion injected into the freedom movement which Sri Aurobindo did. So, having played his indispensable role in the freedom struggle, the divine made sure that he will leave the freedom struggle. And where would he go? That also, through a divine command, he was told to go to Pondicherry. Why Pondicherry? Because it was still the Indian soil, but yet not a British colony, but a French colony. And therefore, that was the right place for him to go. The British would not be able to pursue him there as easily as they could in India, because they would have continued to suspect, even if he said he had stepped out of the freedom struggle, they would have continued to suspect him, and in fact they kept spying on him even in Pondicherry. But the divine kept intervening to make sure that Sri Aurobindo will have a peaceful stay, a relatively peaceful stay in Pondicherry for 40 years from 1910 to 1940. And that is where he discovered his final calling, which was to be a spiritual master and share with India and the world the wisdom which only he could give. So, while he had engaged in some previous occupations as a professor in Baroda and in the freedom struggle, for which also he was very well suited, the work was ethical, but yet that was not his final calling. His final calling was to be a spiritual master, to do that work which only he could do. Now, the work which only one person can do, that is a rare thing to happen. For most of us, probably that type of a rarity will not arise. So for all practical purposes, for an ordinary person, what is it that one has to keep in mind while selecting one's career? Firstly, that one should be well suited for it in terms of his gifts, talents, and everything. Secondly, the work should be ethically sound. Third, one should be guided by the circumstances. For example, it was the circumstances which guided Sri Aurobindo to the freedom movement. If the country was not free, then that guides you. So the circumstances can also tell us what is the type of work that I can do in these circumstances with my gifts and talents, and which is ethical in nature. So circumstances also have to be taken into account. But then, apart from that, one doesn't have to think much. When one finds some such work, do it. How to do it? In the spirit of Karma Yoga, with full involvement. And the mother says that that can be done with the work having been selected with reasonable care. One can do that with any type of work, and it is quite possible it may be your temporary occupation. Only when one handles the temporary occupation in the spirit of Karma Yoga, as Sri Aurobindo did his work at Baroda as a teacher and his work in the freedom struggle, if one does it in the spirit of Karma Yoga, you will eventually discover your final calling. And if the final calling is different from the temporary occupation, it also means that if one feels that there are clues in life which are making one feel that, well, so far this was okay, but now this is not okay, then one should be prepared to change. So the final calling may not be the same as the temporary occupation. But then what is it that unites everything, the temporary occupation as well as the final calling? Two most important things. One is choose a career and work in that career, do that work, thinking beyond your little self. Look beyond yourself. Don't think only in terms of the satisfactions of your own body and mind. What are these satisfactions? Physical comforts, some sort of fleeting pleasures coming in life, and intellectual satisfaction from the work. These are still relatively superficial and selfish. If not selfish, at least self-centered. Think beyond it, look beyond yourself, look around, and looking around, what do? Give something. What do you give? Give what you have. You can naturally give only what you have. To whom? To one who needs it. So in whatever occupation you are, even if it is your temporary occupation, if you look around, you'll always find there'll be something that you can give and somebody who needs it. Find that complementary situation. Keep doing that. You will one day discover your final calling. So that, I think, can be the final sentence of this. And I'll just close with a prayer. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnam Evavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.